Hello and welcome to episode 103 of A Gamer Looks at 40. I'm Bill Tucker, and this week's episode isn't gonna have the cold open. It's no dramatic music at the beginning, just a strange compilation of thoughts, ideas, and recollections. Now, unlike part 1 and part 2, where we had firm guidelines on the stories being shared, this one's a bit of a mixed bag, and in this, our final part of the Final Fantasy IV puzzle, we are going to discuss mechanics, story, silly critiques, and various random comments designed to delight and maybe confound, or a little bit of both. You know, not for nothing, not every episode needs to be this tightly wound snare drum of narrative and journalistic drive. Sometimes it can be as random as a frying pan to the back of Yang's head. Time to board our airship, embark for the moon, and try to ignore that whole walking around without oxygen thing as we embark upon Final Fantasy IV Part 3, all the things we haven't talked about yet. When I think Final Fantasy fan, a few names come instantly to mind. Moses, aka the well-read mage of the Pixels.com and Gamelogica on YouTube, is one of them. To open the episode, Moses shares why he thinks new players should start with this 16-bit classic.
4 is actually the game that I would say to almost anybody to start with. If you wanted to start with the Final Fantasy series, where do you start? You could start with the first one. Let's face it, the first one's rough. It is.
It's rough.
It is rough.
It is.
I've never beaten the NES version because every time I tried, I've hated it. I think it's one of those where you have to grow up with it. And I unfortunately did not. I wish I had, because it's a foundational game. Same thing with Dragon Warrior. I didn't have it as a kid. Played it for the first time as an adult. Love those games and what they represent, but they're not exactly my favorite games to play. But 4, I think if you can look at yourself and realize that you are not just your preferences, that you're capable of understanding, a piece of entertainment, if you want to call it a work of art, whatever, as separate from, this is almost, like we were saying about Draken, as separate from your preferences and still able to find what's good and what's bad in something aside from your preferences, then I think you have the capacity to enjoy Final Fantasy IV. It's a game that's meant a lot to a lot of people, but I think fundamentally, it's really, it seems like in a lot of ways, it's the first Final Fantasy, despite being the fourth one. It doesn't have interchangeable jobs, but then neither did 1. It had jobs that you picked from the start. And you do get different jobs in the form of characters entering and leaving your party. But the active time battle system is here. That wound up being a huge influence upon a lot of Final Fantasy games. And it really is the one that starts to feel like it's confident in the direction that the series is going in,
It has a voice.
Yeah.
It feels like it has a voice. And I think it's they took 1, 2, and 3 and took the best parts of all 3 and combined to one. Even with the jobs, like you said, when you have characters switching out, that's your job switching.
Yeah.
So they've, instead of focusing on these in Final Fantasy 3, where like we just said, you have these 4 characters that have literally almost no story, but lots of different jobs and things to do. I think they realized, hey, let's really lean into the characters and have the jobs just be part of those characters.
Yeah.
So if you enjoy the jobs, you still get your Dragoon, you'll still get your mages, you'll still get all those things. But it's focusing more on the characters and those journeys. And I think it's really effective. Really effective.
Yeah, it really is. So I don't care if a person, doesn't like retro games, or if a person only plays modern games or whatever. You need to play Final Fantasy IV. I think if you want a comprehensive perspective on what the series is and can appreciate or gain an appreciation, whether to the positive or negative, for the subversion of some of those elements in current Final Fantasy, I think you have to have a chronological understanding of a historical understanding of Final Fantasy. And that's really 100% 4. So, play this one. I wouldn't recommend people jump straight into 5 after 4. Play 6.
No,
5 is a great
6.
game, but it's also a comedy, which I think people will really get thrown off about. Obviously, there's comedic elements in other Final Fantasies, but that is the only one that I would say it's a comedy rather than a drama.
It felt like a farce. Almost like a classic farce.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, 5 I did not finish. I bounced off of it. I was excuse me. I was going through all the remasters in one go, like I hit 5 and I just hit the wall. I was like, okay, too much.
Eventually you fatigue too.
I fatigued. I just ran out of steam. I liked it fine, but I just fatigued on it.
Because I tried the same thing. I was beat 1, 2, 3, and then after I beat 3, I was like, I don't want to do any more of these.
I was hellbent on 4 because I didn't play 4 as a kid. I played 4 relatively recently, maybe a few years ago, and then I played it again on the remasters. So I don't have a lot of strong personal nostalgia for 4 at all. Like Final Fantasy 6, Final Fantasy 1 was extremely formative and very important to me as a person. And then Final Fantasy 6. That's when I jumped in and realized, oh wow, games can tell these amazing stories. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool. And we're gonna talk at length at 6. It might be a Final Fantasy 6 month.
Yeah, you have to.
Because there's so much. I might do a show just on Kefka.
Yeah, you should.
I think I might have to, because again, we're gonna talk about it. We're gonna take our time and really take our time with 4 and 6, of course. But man, there's so much there. But for 4, it was very much so for me. Okay, this is a game I didn't experience as a kid. What's it like now? And sure enough, I was really just taken aback by it. And again, as an older gamer who doesn't have the time that an 11-year-old has, I loved how trim it moves. I mean, you can get through that game in 20 hours. Totally. And these days, that's lovely. That is.
I beat a game in 20 hours instead of 100 plus. Yeah.
100 plus, right? Exactly. It's like, man, 16. Do I really want to go through 100 hours a game again?
No, it's good. It's not grindy. It's relatively short. Nope. The pacing's really good. It's totally worth playing in 2024.
No, I 1000% agree for sure. On A Gamer Looks at 40, we don't often focus on gameplay. As a memories and recollection show, I like to leave the nuts and bolts to, reviewers. People who are good at that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean the topic is completely off limits. And when you're talking about a game like Final Fantasy IV, inevitably, how it feels in your hands is going to come up. Starting us off on a brief conversation regarding the mechanics of Final Fantasy IV is Greg Sewart of the Player One podcast and Generation 16 series of videos, followed by Julian of the Stage Select podcast, and finally John of the Beat Crohn's Foundation. I mean the ATB system, we did talk about that very briefly, how revolutionary that was and how it really became the standard for generations, I think. I mean, really, ATB...
And not just in Final Fantasy. I feel like
anywhere.
I feel like it influenced Japanese role-playing games sort of in general for a long time. Even just as a building block to create something else. Like I look at something like one of my all-time favorite battle systems in an RPG is the original Grandia on the Saturn and PlayStation. And not that the ATB is not that it's too similar to that, but I always felt that you could see the influence in that system because basically they took the same idea, but they put all of the characters on the screen, both enemies and protagonists, on one timeline, and you could see who was about to go next, and you sort of had to plan your strategy around that. I think that was, for me, like the ATB, it made the fighting feel a little bit more active. Even playing it the last few days, I realized, especially I just came down out of Mount Ordeal on remake, the Pixel remaster, and realizing that because I was casting so many spells, because it's really a magic sort of section of the game, that I wasn't even really watching what was happening on the screen as much as I was watching the next menu to set up the different spells and the different sort of I'll say combos, not really a combo, but I want this. Yeah. I want Palom to heal and tell it as cast this black magic and that sort of thing. And in as much as it made the battle system or the battles feel more dynamic and more active, it also just lent this whole new strategy element to it, because again, having only played the first Final Fantasy before that, or having played the 2 Phantasy Star games that I'd played at that point, you never know who was going next.
Sure.
Right? It was sort of a crapshoot. It's like, well, the game knows there's a clock in there somewhere, there's a number in there somewhere.
Yeah.
But they'd never, they hadn't pulled back the cover and shown that to us. There were no discrete numbers anywhere on screen that told you what was about to happen. So I really feel like the ATB was kind of like the first time, at least in North America, that we were seeing stuff like that. And it always felt like from that point on, you started to see it more often, even in other games, not just Squaresoft games. And that, it was hugely influential.
Are you more of a wait or an active player with the ATB? Do you like to have the game pause while you're figuring things out, or do you want to keep rolling? I'm a wait. I'm a wait kind of guy. Time out.
Yeah.
Time out.
Yeah.
I need to think. I need to think.
I want to know what I'm going to do next. I want to, I want to be able to navigate all those menus, and the world can pause. The world can wait for me, not the other way around. Yeah,
I'm playing this game, not you game. I'm playing. Yeah. I'm in control.
Exactly.
Don't make me hit pause or something. Yeah, that's I'm very exactly. I don't know anybody who does it active. That's a pretty brutal.
You got to know what you're doing, I guess.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, you have to just know what you're doing for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. Growing up, and this is actually something I just recently shed, I was never a fan of job systems because I always felt like I had too much control and I was always too afraid of doing the wrong one. So I did read something about it, which completely removes the point of a job system, which is experimentation and trying things out. And I never liked saying, okay, I'm going to put all my effort into making this person a fighter, right? Because that's what I need right now. Why would I start over with another class or another job type? Now, 5, I like the way 5 implements it. We'll talk about 5, but that kind of central thing never worked for me. But I loved in 4 where you do have those job classes, but they're static. So you're focusing on these characters that represent jobs as opposed to random characters that you change jobs in. I personally really appreciated that.
Yeah, but it's also interesting, and you kind of have to think about Final Fantasy IV from like the Japanese player's perspective, who had gotten to see 1, 2, and 3 beforehand. And as I had said, in a previous interview, right, like going back through from the beginning, I can see the steps from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and how 4 is that culmination of the Famicom era games, right? Because you do have the turn-based system, you do have like the named characters that have backstories a la Final Fantasy II, but then they are also jobs that you would know from Final Fantasy III and also 1 to an extent, right? But I love the fact that it actually also factors in to the story, right? Kane being a dragoon is part of his character. Same thing with Yang being a monk. Right. But then like the core of Cecil's story is that he is a Dark Knight, and the Dark Knight can only go so far when it comes to combating evil. And then when he job changes into a paladin, he starts at level 1, which is what happens in a Final Fantasy game when you change jobs. And it's also my favorite part in the game, because going back down Mount Ordeals and having Cecil just level up like 10 times in a fight is just so satisfying. And I will just power level him like on that mountain, and also get like Palom and Porom to like a good enough level where they've got like level 3 spells. So then I'm just like completely overpowered for like the next elemental boss. But I just love the way that that factors in to the story. And honestly, Dark Knight is my favorite Final Fantasy class, and it's because of Final Fantasy IV. I just love it. It's so edgy.
Interesting.
And you've got a story that goes along with it. You do have people that die for a little while and then come back, but while you're playing it, you think they're dead. You've got a very diverse cast of characters. One of the things I do really, really love about Final Fantasy IV is the way your mages learn spells. Is they just learn it naturally. You don't have to go find anything. You don't have to buy anything. You just naturally progress into getting those abilities. Yep. Now with Rydia getting, as a caller, as she was in that, because she wasn't a summoner yet, that was way too advanced of a thing for for us Americans to get grasp. As she's gotta call them. Hey, Titan, can you come smash these guys for me? They're making me mad. Sorry.
It's all good.
So that's the only time you have to go and do optional things to get Leviathan, Ashura, and Bahamut.
Right.
How do you say it Bahamut? Or?
I say Bahamut. That's how I've.
Yeah, I know there's some people
who say Bahamut. Bahamut. Language is fluid. We don't say thee and thou anymore. It's fine. However you want to say it, it's perfectly fine. There's more important things to argue about than Bahamut.
He's the cool
Bahamut.
Dragon guy.
Cool dragon dude that makes big fire happen. Yes.
Yeah. But that's one of the things I really like about that game is there's not a lot that you have to be afraid of missing. Like, oh man, I forgot to go down this one little hallway and miss this really cool thing. It's like, no, you just kind of progresses along. And if you get curious about some stuff, you can find extra cool things. Because you can beat the game and never have some of those items. Or you can get some of those monsters called.
Over the last couple of episodes, we've been talking about story from the perspective of moments, memories, and characters. On today's episode, we're talking themes. Starting this section is Barry Carenza of Premium Edition Games, followed by Mike of the Distorted Illuminations YouTube channel, and finally Kiss 105.3 in Ottawa radio host Ryan Lindsay.
It's just an emotional game on a whole new level versus Final Fantasy 1 to 3. Like it really said it's like some games when they jump to the 16-bit, we're going to use the power, better graphics, bigger levels, more action. Final Fantasy is like deeper storytelling. That's what we're doing. Because Final Fantasy IV, if you look at it, Super Nintendo, it didn't really harness the power of the Super Nintendo. Mode 7, sure, but you look at the sprites versus Final Fantasy VI, and it's like, wow, big difference. Final Fantasy IV almost could have been an NES game if they really wanted it to. And it's like, wow, they instead of using that to make better sprites, they did such a richer and deeper storytelling that was not possible with the limitations of the NES, and they knocked it out of the park. I mean, what a tremendous game.
And it's interesting you mentioned too about how the emotional weight of Final Fantasy IV, and because remember, Final Fantasy IV was a very early SNES game.
Yes,
that was 91.
It was a launch title.
It was a launch game. Yeah, it was. I believe it wasn't official launch title. Window. It was a holiday. It was launch. Thank you. There you go. Exactly right. No, you're right. I did an article on into SNES launch, so I don't know why that actually had to come out of my head. I'm sorry. You're right. It is launch window. It was a holiday game, but it was a holiday game, so it was. You're right. It did not harness the power. It had Mode 7 because everything had to have Mode 7. The early Super Nintendo days. I suspect that was a requirement.
F-Zero, Pilot Wings.
Everything. Super Tennis had like a thumb thing coming into your face. Yeah. So Anyway, so but it's interesting that they use that power for that. And then when you get to Final Fantasy 6 or 3, that's 95.
Yep.
That's like at the end of the life cycle. They know exactly how to make that hardware sing and do incredible stuff with it. So I agree. I think they made a smart choice and said, hey, let's strip this down. Let's make this relatively linear. The job system, let's really just focus on this, on the characters. Let's take these jobs and apply them to characters. And while you may lose the customization, you're going to get a lot more richness because we're going to have a deeper story that we can tell when we have characters that have these roles, these gameplay roles that fit into personality. And it's stunning.
It's
great.
interesting if you look at that, because Final Fantasy 1 was job system. Final Fantasy 2 was characters with dedicated jobs already established. Final Fantasy 3 went back to the job system. Final Fantasy 4 went to characters with jobs already established. 5 back to job system. 6 characters with jobs already established, but with the espers also customization. 7 same thing, but with materia. It's like they're like, all right, after going back and forth, let's just kind of do both at the same time.
Yeah, no, exactly right. You're exactly right. Any of the strong opinions or stories from your world of Final Fantasy IV? Because again, it sounds like you had a really close relationship with it too. It sounds like you played it a ton.
Yeah, like I love just how well it handles a lot of those themes. Again, as you get older, some things you appreciate a bit more.
Sure.
But again, even as a kid, so much just hits you instantly in that game. I think that's kind of one of the things that game did well, is even without a lot of setup, it manages to get the emotions it wants to across.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I'm a bit older, I do look back and go, okay, some of this may have felt a little more rushed than it could have. Things could have probably been done a bit better, but it's still great. Like, even as a kid, I remember the whole Zermus thing being, okay, you see the Zemus guy that's behind everything. You get this crystal. What is this crystal? Don't know, but it turns him into Zermus. Now you have the real last fight, and I'm like, well, what was all that? What just happened?
So your thinking was it felt a little rushed, maybe, like in the presentation or in the storytelling?
Yeah. At times,
interesting. Yeah, that's fair. And it's a very early Super Nintendo game. I think people forget it was a launch title, at least for holiday. I'm pretty sure it was either a launch title or it was for that holiday release. Like, it was a very early in the life cycle. It was 91. So,
oh yeah. I will say though, years later, looking back at some of the English release, I will never not laugh at the random dwarf child that just asks, "Do you have an ogreish one?"
Do you have an ogreish one? It's pretty good.
And if you want a little insight into some of the insanity I would try to do as a kid,
go for it.
In my head, you know, even though this is what my first RPG, I'm like, there's no way they're going to put me in a fight I can lose. But, you know, you have the fight with Cain, which you lose, it goes on. I'm like, I'm going to beat this fight. Now, there's no emulators. I didn't have internet to tell me I couldn't do this.
No.
I could not tell you how long I, just fought with only Cecil in my party to just grind and grind. I'm winning this fight.
Wow, and you had no idea it was I always wonder that when it comes to unwinnable fights. Where's the kid who's buckled down and said, no, I am not accepting this loss, resets as soon as he dies, and tries it again? That was you.
Yep, that was me.
Oh my gosh, that's so good.
I didn't do it the first time I played the game. But when I went back there, I'm like, I'm beating him this time.
He's going down. He's going down. That's crazy. What did you eventually just say it's impossible and then realize that the point was to lose? Like, that's the story beat, is to lose?
Yeah. I realized that, mind you, I couldn't tell you the level I was actually at by that point, but
sure.
I did hit the point. I'm like, all right, either there is some weird thing to do that I am not understanding, or this is just not happening.
Right, this is just not this is not meant to be, clearly. other moments from that game that you really just need to connect with or just bowled you over, again, as a kid or as an adult, either way?
Well, I mean, as a kid, they didn't hit as hard. The more I
Right.
saw all these little moments, like Sid appearing as a kid, I'm like, that guy's cool. And that was the reaction of pretty much every moment that happened, aside from Palm and Porm. Even as a kid, I understood the gravity of that one a little bit.
Sure.
Cecil moving into being a paladin was a huge moment. You're like, oh, what just happened? Dude, he's got pink hair. This is huge. What just happened? This is a big moment. As an adult going back and playing it again, all of the storyline arcs have a moment that punches you in the heart. It didn't hit me when I was a kid, but like Rydia dealing with the everything that she's lost in the very first, hour you're playing the game?
Mhm.
Huge. Massive. The love stories and angles that were intertwined that as a kid, you're like, blech, ew, kisses, gross. Now I'm looking back on it like, wow, this is really well written, and almost gave me something to strive for as I got older. Like, as dumb as it sounds, video games may have actually fed a little bit of the desire to be a bit of a romantic.
Hey, it was the first time I had seen anything that related to that way, or it was definitely formative for, I think, a lot of people in that way. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yep. And
totally.
Those storylines were there. Again, that's another thing that made us all kind of fall in love with the game. You had these moments, you had these emotional connections, you have these characters, and these teeny things that happen. You're like, wow, okay, I'm feeling some type of emotion now because that teeny little sprite is singing to another sprite what just happened. This is really, really cool. Or the hatred that you felt for the villains and their consistent need to step in and mess with everything and stop you at every turn. It hit so hard as a kid from that side. As an adult, I'm like, wow, it's cheesy, but it's still well done, you know?
It is time once again to thank my wonderful patrons, starting with Greg Sewart of the aforementioned Player One podcast and Generation 16 series of videos, the Let's Play Princess, Tim Knowles, formerly of The Leadist, Seth Sergil of the All End podcast, Terry Canaire, Games with Coffee, BT Goebbels, Julian of the Stage Select podcast, and finally the wonderful and always well-groomed Pete Harney. I don't know that as a fact, I'm just assuming. If you want to join these amazing human beings in supporting the show financially, mosey on over to A Gamer Looks at 40 on Patreon. Patreon.com/A Gamer Looks at 40. Review the tiers, and if something strikes your fancy, sign up today. One of the many comments I heard over and over again during my interviews was Final Fantasy IV is a tight experience and you should play it first. Building on those ideas is content creator Mekel Kasanova, followed by musician and video game remixer Mustin. Then John returns before Mike of MageORage TV swings by to give his opinions and perspectives.
I really got into the story because, the whole thing about redemption for Cecil and, the betrayals, constant betrayals from Cain, and then the love story between Cecil and Rosa. And it was just, you look at it now and it's not really that elaborate of a story. Mm-hmm. But then, in context of early 90s, it's really like the only other thing I can think of right back then, as far as in the West that we had that could even be equal to it, would probably be Phantasy Star 2. We don't talk about Phantasy Star 3, but let's talk about that one.
Hey, I'll mention that one. That's
we don't talk about that one. But yeah, but because I played Final Fantasy 2 first, like it really stuck with me, and everything that just going through that, learning, because for those of you who are too young to understand, back then RPGs were not really the norm, because you usually had platformers, shoot 'em ups or shmups, and belt scrollers we used to call them back in the day, or beat 'em ups and fighting games. Those were the rage. So when you had an RPG, that was super, super niche. So that got me into it. I got really addicted to it. And I went back and I think the summer, I think it was the year it came out. Yeah, that year it came out. I think that summer or that fall, I played through it twice on my own just because I was so enraptured with it. And I really wanted to play another one. And I think we picked up Final Fantasy 1 for the NES, but it was just too archaic for me, and the fact that the story just really wasn't like, there's a pretty good story there. It's very basic, but it didn't grab me the way 2 did. So
a lot of really good points, especially about the story. It's amazing, the Paladin moment, which I replayed Final Fantasy IV last year, I think, in preparation for this whole series, and it had been a solid 15 years since I had played it, and I was baffled how well it holds up. Final Fantasy IV, it has no fat on it. It's a trim game, and I like how you mentioned also it's linear. It doesn't feel linear, but it definitely, there is a path to follow if you're paying attention.
Yeah.
I think it's good.
There are some of those little extra caves you don't have to go into, and some of the summons and stuff. But as far as the story goes, it's all good. It doesn't matter what you do, or whether or not you talk to a character first or eat some old man's lunch. It's just going to be this game.
Diesel's the Dark Knight and his little character sprite in the menu screen. Did you ever watch In Living Color back in the day?
A bit, yeah. I watched some of it. Yeah, a little bit. I wasn't a regular watcher, but a bit, yeah.
Do you remember the character they had on there called the Head Detective? It was just a little head with a pair of shoes under his feet.
I think
the
so.
Sprite,
Vague.
The sprite
memory
of Cecil in the menu screen is the Head Detective.
Okay.
From
validate this.
In Living Color. No, it's
Detective in Living Color. Okay, here we go. Let's see. I'm looking at it now. Oh, that's really
now go ridiculous. Find
Cecil.
Go find yeah.
Uh-huh.
And it's the way like his armor looks.
See if I can find this here.
But the way his armor looks,
you're talking a little headshot,
Yeah, in the menu, because like the way his armor looks right underneath his head, it looks like 2 little feet. At least that's what I always see.
All right, we're gonna validate this. I'm putting everything on pause just so I can. Yes, I see it. I see it.
You see it?
It's so ridiculous.
You see it?
Yes, I do. I do see it. It's very ridiculous. These are the 2 little bumps on the bottom underneath his chin. He
looks like they look like
detective.
2 little feet. He looks like the Head Detective.
That's so
I'm glad. I'm glad that it's not just me. Like, it was like me and my cousin make that joke all the time. He's the one that had Ultima Exodus.
It's so
and
random.
Like both he and I love 4 to death. Like I think for both of us, it's our favorite game. And so, but we've always made that joke about like, yeah, he looks like the Head Detective. So I'm glad that you can see it, even though you weren't really familiar with the Head Detective character. Just seeing those 2 pictures side by side, it's like, oh yeah, it's there.
For those listening, do this. Go on this journey. Take 2 minutes of your day. Go on this little journey. You will never look at that little headshot on the Final Fantasy IV Super Nintendo version again the same way. That's really, really funny. That's really good. I like that a lot. What are some big? I mean, Final Fantasy IV, as you basically said, is a very curated experience, and I love it for that. I love how of any Final Fantasy game, maybe other than X, but I would still put Final Fantasy IV ahead of it. It's got no fat on it. It's like a lean, curated, tight experience. Like. Every swing it takes connects. And now you can't say that about 6 because 6 is bigger, more expansive, and I have a personal love for 6 that's I can't even be objective about 6. That's how much I connect with it personally because I didn't play 4 as a kid. I played it as much later in life. And but when I played it again on the remasters, especially, I was just struck by how narratively tight it is, and the game just moves, and it's a really. I would almost say if you want to play a 16-bit Final Fantasy game and you were unfamiliar with Final Fantasy, I would probably say start with 4 before 6 because you get the rhythms in, you know?
You get a really good feel for what an RPG can be, or a JRPG, because that's exactly it. You don't have to do a lot of grinding. At the end, you do. You should do some grinding at the end. You don't have to really do a lot of exploring. Like, I don't know where to go next. There's not a lot of that. And there's plenty of places that you can save the game. I wouldn't necessarily call it hand-holding, but you kind of get a picture of what it is you need to do and where you need to go. And really, and it's like, at the end, because there's those like little hidden paths that you can go on to get all the best weapons and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. That's really the only time it's like, I'm not really sure where to go in this maze to get these things. I see this weapon over here, but I don't know how to get it. That's, but by that point, you kind of want to go do a little exploring. You want to go beef your party up. Yeah. You want to go, Edge, for the love of God, please stop dying. Just, you're a ninja. You're a ninja. I know I can put you in the back row, but for God's sakes, take a hit, man. That is the one thing I will say. Like, Edge is so underpowered. In the end game, like everyone else is just moving along and calling down the thunder of the god. You're calling a dragon, for God's sakes. Edge is like, I'm gonna hit you with my sword. Oh, don't hit me back. Oh no! I know you can put him in the back. Yeah, I know you can put him in the back row and do that, but you shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to have Kane and Cecil in the front. Exactly.
He's a ninja. Yes.
But I'll put him in front all the same and watch him die and just go this again. Okay, fine. Here's another Life 2 spell for you, guy.
You have a great point about just the sacrifice of, being such a motif throughout the game and a recurring occurrence and theme. I mean, we've got Tella, Yang, Sid, very melodramatic. I have Absolutely. I kind of have this theory that like most Final Fantasy titles, especially like the big core ones, are a type of play or movie. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so four I feel like is the melodrama of the series. If 6 is your opera and 7 was your first big budget film, 4 is your melodrama. And Golbez is your villain. He's taken the damsel and putting her in distress. He might as well tie her to a railroad track when he has her in the Tower of Zot.
You're right. You're exactly. That's a very good. I have not heard that before. That's a very interesting way of framing Final Fantasy IV as in terms of its cinematics and its storytelling structure. I think that's actually really good and interesting. And it's a good melodrama. Like again, melodrama is sometimes used as a pejorative, but I don't know. There's something really good and charming about it. And
charming is a perfect word for melodrama. I feel the same way about melodramas.
Yeah, I think there's something like very charming about it. And what I also really appreciate for 4 is I think 4 is such a tight game. Of all the Final Fantasy games, I would say Final Fantasy 4. I can't say it's the best, but I think it's definitely the tightest one. It's got no fat on it. Like it's a lean, wonderfully crafted story, a blend of mechanics and jobs and music, of course, and everything else. It's really extraordinarily crafted. My heart is for 6. I love 6. That's a formative game for me. But 4 is such a surprisingly great adventure. It's so good.
Completely agree with everything you just said. It's the side quests that you have in it. They're few, but they're meaningful, and they're fairly unobtuse. getting the pink tail being like kind of the exception to that, but the rest of it, it kind of follows. You get the hint for the smith. You find him in the Dwarven world. He tells you what he wants to get the adamantite, or the smith says he needs adamantite. Then you find the person who wants to trade, but finding the pink tail, it's a whole thing in and of itself, man. I consider it a badge of honor. I apparently had really good RNG as a middle schooler, and
nice.
I never thought that it was like a rare or hard thing to get. I thought it was just like you needed to know where to go and just be patient for a little bit. I didn't realize the drop rate was as incredibly low as it is until I got to be an adult, and I had trouble with it. I'm like, why the hell isn't it dropping? This is nuts.
How long am I supposed to do this for? That's so
right. This feels like getting the Sword of Kings.
Yeah, right. That's really funny. I don't remember the drop rate, but I do remember that being just a tricky thing. But yeah, no, because it's also, Final Fantasy IV, I think, is also very linear in that way, but to its benefit, because again, that's why I think it's so trim and just the pacing is excellent too in that game. Like, you always feel like you're making progress. You always feel like you're moving forward. There's lots of really amazing things in there. Now, even the most ardent fan will have a hard time finding major faults in Final Fantasy IV. But you can have loads of minor quibbles. In a section included purely for funzos, Moses joins the chat to discuss the realistic rendering of some of the characters in other versions of the game. Barry bemoans one too many logos, and Ryan has an issue with sound effects. Pal and Porum, for some reason, I really were fun. I was really just drawn to them for some reason. Maybe because they were kids and they're just They had that bickering between like that brother sister kind of bickering was very endearing to me. I don't know why. I just really enjoyed spending time with them.
Now, have you seen their more realistic renders? I think it's from the 3D.
I have not.
Okay,
I don't think so.
How do I share an image with you here?
There is a chat.
All right. I hope you're sitting down. So I bring this up to kind of, just illustrate a point about the period of time that this game appeared in. It didn't facilitate graphics that looked, quite like this.
Okay.
And I don't think that it needed to, because once you look at these characters in these forms, isn't there something just wrong about that? Like, it just looks
there's an uncanny valley occurring here.
Exactly.
That's unsettling. Yeah, I don't know. Oh no, I don't like that at all.
No.
They feel like like porcelain dolls that have come to life.
Yeah. There's something
No.
There's something weird.
A little cursed. You gotta stop. Okay, now you're sending me too many of these things.
No, the third one is Watch Your Brains Out. Cool. The third one is the Yoshitaka Amano version.
Yeah. And the third one is the Amano version, which is playful and fun. Yeah. They have a little mischievousness to them.
Where they look like
the
children.
Other two, yes, they look like kids, and they're playing with little monster.
Not sure what the other ones are supposed to be. They look like some weird kind of proportions or
Polar Express.
There it is. Polar Express.
It's Polar Express. They belong sitting next to Tom Hanks on a train headed to the North Pole.
Yeah.
That's where they need to be.
And so, again, I bring that up to say there may be people listening who, won't be too familiar with Final Fantasy IV, and may not want to play Final Fantasy IV because of the way it looks. And that's just an unfortunate reality of not just games, but art in general. I don't want to see that because I don't like the way it looks. And everybody's entitled to their own preference and maintaining those, and that's fine.
Sure.
But making them more realistic does not make them better. I'll meet folk who are like, oh, I hope they give the Final Fantasy VII Remake treatment to every Final Fantasy. And I was like, it won't work. It just will not work. We've seen Square pursue rendering the Final Fantasy VII characters into realistic worlds. So that all makes sense. They've done kind of that process. but with some of these worlds, they just look better as little chibi sprites. They just do.
Because the original art design was designed or intended to show you character because of those limitations. So they had to be very intentional, I feel, in how they design these characters, design these animations, have to make them emote, with using very limited animations. So when you up-res it and make it more modern, with all the technology we have, you have to then replace that with something.
Yeah.
Like some of that charm, that light is gone.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what it is. If I knew what it is, I'd be a millionaire because I would harness that knowledge and use it for the forces of good as opposed to evil. But there's something lost when you make it too pretty.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think it may, and personally, it may be kind of like reading a book as opposed to seeing a movie where you have to fill in the blanks yourself. So if I see a little character, a 16-bit character on a screen, I don't have all the details. My brain will fill that in though.
Yeah.
Kind of like when I'm reading a book. Most authors aren't going to tell you exactly what a character looks like. They give you the high points so you can place them, but you fill in the rest of the stuff yourself. I think it's very similar when it comes to retro games. We'll do that work. Our imaginations will do that for us. And when everything is out there displayed, I now have no choice but to accept what the game is giving me. And if it doesn't quite jive perfectly, then that's where I think it causes some friction. So when you go from the simple to the complex, the things I've put inside of it to fill in those blanks, if they're not represented in the new and fancy and shiny, that causes a weird dissonance. And that's not necessarily fair. I think that's just the way adaptations work. And that's because we can get to a whole other conversation about
No, I get what
adaptations, but you know what I mean? So long way of saying I agree.
Yeah.
Let's leave those alone.
I get what you're saying. I think that like on a scale of style versus substance, 4 skews heavily towards substance versus style. Whereas
totally.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say a lot of new Final Fantasy skews more towards style versus substance. There is a lot of very impressive visuals coming out of some of Square's AAA work, not all of it. Forspoken, I'm thinking about you right now. But
poor Forspoken. He never had a chance.
It didn't deserve one. Anyways, but with 4 though, yeah, I think you're looking at something that couldn't really say have the style of some of the more impressive, visually impressive Super Nintendo RPGs. And so it kind of has to rely on other tactics in order to generate that engagement and that interest. And I think it does that rather well.
My only problem with it, I'd say the only thing is it's the only game that has 2 logos, and it's like, what the heck?
Yeah.
Which one is now the official? Because 4 remakes doesn't say remake. It just it's
right.
Well, I mean, Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3 technically do too, but I don't really count the original logos. I like the stylized logo. But 4 has 2 of the stylized logo, one with the dragon and the new one, and one with Cain. And for me, it's always going to be Cain. But it's just it's just funny. Right. Like, why? Why'd you have to make a new logo?
That's so good. I love that. That's very funny. It's amazing. It's a marvel that and it's early Super Nintendo too. Like we're talking 1991, late 91 release date in North America, and it is remarkable. It takes the first 3 Final Fantasies and just creates this awesome distillation. It's just great distillation of story and gameplay. I love the way it plays too. I mean, it was the first one that had the active time system, if I'm not mistaken. And pretty confident that's right.
Game changer, man.
Yeah, totally. I played the first Final Fantasy as a kid on the NES, and waiting for characters to do their thing, ineffective, stabbing air.
Oh my god.
All that going away and having this really elegant system where it felt more dynamic but still turn-based. That blew my mind. That was one of those just eye openers for me.
Plus, when there were spells cast, and I may get some serious boos and hisses from people for this, if there's one thing I despised about the original on the NES when I was a kid, it's the sound of like a lit spell. Oh, next level. I cannot handle. And I'm a big audio nerd now. This whole doing radio for as long as I have now. Going back, it's still it grates me a little bit.
Is it the spell? Is it the okay? Is it the spell itself, or is it the is it the actual connecting sound? Is it the actual?
No, not that
yeah
noise. Isn't that bad? As weird as it sounds, because hearing it now, making that noise, I'm like, God, that's terrible. But no, the spell noises. Oh, did I hate them? Hated them with a passion. When we get
I'm gonna
2, 4, whatever. Beautiful, completely different.
I'm gonna just drop that right here. So editor Bill, later, just drop a sound effect. Just drop it there. Boom. Here it is.
My fist and scream at the sky. Okay, we're good. We're good.
Pretend I have like an instant replay or something in front of me where I can actually do that on the fly. I do not.
As you can see, the Black Mage here is casting this, and you're drawing little circles around it and making a little movement like you're Madden. Oh, you're
good. Did you know they tried to make a sequel to Final Fantasy IV known as The After Years? Did you know it was initially released on everyone's favorite platform of choice, mobile and WiiWare? Did you know you had to buy it in pieces? Well, neither did I until researching for this series and asking my guests if they had played it. Most of them said no. Only Greg Sewart and Barry Carenza said yes. While we're thinking about it, did you play The After Years?
I was just about to ask you if you played The After Years.
I never have played The After Years. No,
I tried to play The After Years when they were released on the Wii.
Yep.
I think they were the first release.
I think it was Wii and then mobile. I want to say that. Let me just confirm that for a second. Yeah, it was on mobile, Wii, and then they released for everything. It was originally released in 2008 in Japan for mobile phones, and then released worldwide as a port for WiiWare. Yeah, so it was worldwide on the Wii.
So I did get them on the Wii, and I tried to play it, but the difficulty was so high.
Was it?
That I finally had to give up on it. I wasn't enjoying it at that point. Yeah, it was just the difficulty was cranked through the roof. Which was too bad because I really wanted to experience the story. In the After Years, you're playing as the children of a lot of the characters, I think.
Right.
And so, I was interested in that, and it was great to sort of revisit that universe so long after the original game came out. But yeah, boy, I couldn't do it.
It's so funny. It's so interesting. I know a lot of people just weren't a fan of the way it was released. And I again, it was one of those where I knew about it, but I don't think I was in like Final Fantasy IV mode. And again, I hadn't played the game at the time, so it was really no point for me at all. But yeah, I was just curious if you had played that because people have very mixed reactions.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Well, it's Final Fantasy. Of course there's mixed reactions. Yeah. There's very few consistent consistent thoughts about Final Fantasy series. I love that theme of sacrifice and everybody for the greater good.
Well, they had to do the Disney ending, I think, afterwards because of the After Years. I don't know if you played the After Years or not.
I didn't play the After Years, so I did not play
the After Years. Since I'm assuming you're not going to have a chapter on it, and it'll just be part of 4. The After Years was a mobile game, and it was episodic. And I played the WiiWare version because that was the first version released here. The PSP version there's like a middle chapter in between the two games that I never played. That was exclusive to that version, but the After Years had some really interesting moments. Obviously Cyrodiil, I think his name is Cecil's son with Rosa as the main character. But what's interesting is they kind of bring some things full circle. Like you find Cain, and at this point, Cain he's kind of disconnected from the world because of all his past trauma and everything that he did, and he feels like the guilt from everything he did in Final Fantasy IV, and he's like a hermit on a mountain, if I remember correctly, and he looks over Theodore, and eventually you wind up back in the same place that Cecil was, and Kain has his own moment and becomes a holy dragoon to repent for all that he did in Final Fantasy IV proper. And now he's a dragoon with like healing spells and stuff. And I'm like, that's so cool.
That's really cool. People are critical of the after years.
Yeah.
People don't love them. Is it because it's mobile? Is that the
it's so because it's episodic.
That sounds really cool.
Oh no, it is.
Yeah, that sounds really. It sounds awesome.
It's episodic. So you're playing with a certain character for chapter 1, and then chapter 2 you're different characters, and by the end everyone comes together. But the problem is whenever you have a game like that is it's not balanced well. So by the time you're in the final chapter with everybody, the enemies just wipe the floor with you because you have everybody, but not everybody is up to the right level. And it's just like the difficulty spike. And like, I never beat after years because of that. I got to the final thing. I'm like, yeah. And the enemies just keep wiping the floor with me. And I'm like, this isn't fun anymore. Like, come on. Like this is too high of a difficulty spike. At least give me, and you can't go back. It's not like, well, let me go back to an earlier chapter. You're locked. You save your data and you move on, and that's it. So the only area to grind is the area kicking my ass. So I'm like, but the story it was telling was very, very good. And I'm glad they did that with the PSP release, but it's also sad that like with Pixel Remaster, they haven't done that with After Years. Like, come on, like it's there, it exists. You're supposed to celebrate it.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that's a very interesting point. It's not ever come up again outside of that mobile space and
mobile WiiWare and then
like I said,
PSP. That's it.
PSP,
and PSP is the only physical version of that exists. And WiiWare is now dead, so you can't even download the original WiiWare version of it. So PSP copy is the only way to legally play that right now.
In closing out the episode, let's throw everything into a giant goulash and hope for the best. Julian starts us out talking about his first time beating the game, followed by MageORage Mike's favorite bit of translated dialogue, and then Greg returns to talk about how perception is everything. Any other final memories about 4 that you want to share, or any other thoughts before we move on to maybe 5? And who knows? I mean, I have time. We can maybe even hit 6 if we want to just completely just go over time. But any other thoughts?
It might be fun. This might just be a fun anecdote. I did not finish Final Fantasy IV for years because I never owned it once I got my Super Nintendo, which was 94 probably, relatively late in the cycle. Final Fantasy IV had kind of come and gone, right? Like at the time I didn't know of like used video game stores, and it wasn't something that you could buy new anymore. And also we weren't really like the type of family that could afford new games very often. So I rented it, absolutely, but I still couldn't finish it. And it wasn't until many years later when I was working at Game Fellas and a used copy came in and I snatched it up and I finally finished it. I would have probably been like 19 at that point. And I finally saw the ending of Final Fantasy IV. And it still got me. Like it still made me cry. And it still makes me cry to this day. But like the fact that like it took that long to actually finally finish that game for me it's kind of silly when I think about it now, because again, not a very long game. But I think part of it was just I always liked to start from the beginning. And then, I guess I was also just not, it always felt way bigger of a game back then than it really is. And yeah, it was a long time coming to see that conclusion.
And I think there's something very poignant and sweet about that, because it does sound like you were able to complete something that you never had the opportunity to do because, again, you were renting it, right? You were renting it, regularly with your family and your friends, and yeah. So there's something very poignant about that, saying I finally finished a thing that I love, and it sounds like that your love for it was well founded in that it lived up to expectations. Because because again, this is a revered game for you. Now you get to finish it. there is a chance it lets you down, and it sounds like it most certainly did not. And that's cool that you were able to have a really cool cathartic moment of completion. Like, yes, I've gotten it. This is now done, and I can and move on. That's pretty cool, man. But yeah, I was really taken aback about how much I really liked that game. I thought it was, there's something really special about being told a good story. Because obviously when we're playing video games, we want to experience a story. We want to be the story, and that's great. But there is the storytelling in 4 through the play is absolutely masterful. And it's unlike most games in the series that had come that since, even 6, I can't say blends it as seamlessly as 4 does.
I definitely, it's funny because on every element, I like 6 better. And I can freely admit that 6 is the better video game. I personally think that it is the ultimate like vision of Final Fantasy. But I just can't step away from like just my intrinsic love of Final Fantasy 4. And again, so much of that is just rooted in such early memories, and it also having one of my favorite soundtracks, and those like obviously the music in the games before that do a good job of propelling the story, but it becomes such a much bigger part of the process in 4, right? Like the needle drops. There's certain points where you could tell that they were like, this has to happen after a moment, right? Like there has to be a pause before this piece of music plays to really hammer home what's happening right now. And they do that so often to such a masterful degree, and it just gets better from there. But 4 was the first time that I saw it, and that's what makes it so special to me.
You've got like some of the most iconic and quotable moments in Final Fantasy. I mean, I think everybody who's at least halfway familiar with the franchise has at least once heard or read "You Spoony Bard."
Yeah, it's such a classic line, absolutely. And people were a little upset when they removed that from the remasters. Did they remove that from the remasters? There's other ones they have. I don't remember. Did they remove that?
I think it was previous versions, but I'm pretty sure they inserted Spoony Bard into the PR, and there was a reference in 16.
That is it. Yes, I heard about I've not played 16 yet. I got a ways to go before I get there, so I have some time. But yes, it is in the remasters, but it's not in other versions because they fixed that translation, which everyone loves that. That's "You Spoony Bard." Come on, it's awesome. It's so iconic.
It's one of the best Woolseyisms, and he just brought such charm and magic to the translation, just working miracles, working like in extreme deadlines to translate so much text. And these are complicated scripts for the time, for the constraints of the memory, and therefore like the number of characters, for them to convey the kind of like by this point very effective emotional storytelling that they have perfected in the previous 2 entries. This one just really brought it to a head.
When you think back on Final Fantasy IV now as an adult, and you think back on that time you played it as a kid, obviously it brings back some great memories for you. What do you think? How do you think your perception of the game has changed over the years? Because obviously, when you played as a young person, it's a totally different experience than when you play it as an adult. Do things jump out at you more now that you're playing it again on the Pixel remasters? Or is it more of just like this nostalgic thing where it's like, wow, yeah, I remember what it was like when I was playing in my friend's house.
Right. I think out of context, it's more of a nostalgia thing. Mm-hmm. playing it now, and that's one of the things that I love about the Pixel remasters is that you can sort of get a very sort of compact version of the experience if you want to turn on the different options that they give you, which is fantastic. I love that.
Yeah.
That's one of the best part of those releases. But like I mentioned earlier, experiencing Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy III years later, and then going back and playing Final Fantasy IV again, you can see the echoes of 1, 2, and 3 in 4 way more clearly than you could if you were in North America and playing these games as they were released here. You know, Final Fantasy IV, sure, it felt like a sequel to Final Fantasy 1 insofar as any Final Fantasy feels like a sequel to the previous game. Because, you know, they're so famously, one has nothing to do with the other for the most part. But, you know, going back and looking at it years later, especially from a critical standpoint, having done sort of the game journalism thing and having been a game developer and a game designer for a while as well, and really being able to break down the elements of those previous games and really see where they informed what was done in Final Fantasy IV. Just playing Final Fantasy IV by itself nowadays doesn't really stir anything different. I don't perceive it any differently than I would have, except for the fact that I have the experience of playing those other 2 games that were previously missing in the canon, right?
Sure. And finally, Mike from Distorted Illuminations talks about a particularly tricky encounter. Trevor and Jeff from New Dad Gaming joins the fun to sort of talk about the game. Mekel closes us out with some final thoughts. So, what other memories of Final Fantasy do you have? So, you obviously played 4. We talked about 6 a lot for your show, and we were comparing to Chrono Trigger. I'd love to have some of that conversation as well for this. Like, hear some of your experience with 6. But anything else on 4 before we move on to 6?
My biggest nightmare in 4 was the evil wall. That fight ruined me so many times.
Oh no! The evil wall. Why am I getting flashbacks from that?
See, even Final Fantasy IV, like, that's one of those games. Like, early RPGs, it's just kind of this rule of thumb. Status effects don't work on bosses, but 4 is not entirely true with that. Because Slow worked on the evil wall, but I didn't know. I'd already gotten in that mindset from just that game. Don't waste your time with status effects. They're not going to do anything. It's like, oh, you could have just cast Slow on him this whole time.
Yep. Yeah, because the biggest problem with it, the wall advances. So for those who maybe not have experienced it, forgot about it, the wall, remind me, forgive me if I'm wrong, but the wall slowly creeps towards you. And once it gets to a certain level, it does like an kills all or attack or instant death or something.
Every attack it does once it gets right up to you is a one shot.
Oh, see, that's the thing.
There's
that's
no
the
defending
thing.
against it. Mind you got a couple rounds at that point to not get hit. But
right.
Yeah.
Yes.
The moment
and
I
it's
realized
creepy.
Slow didn't work, or when I realized Slow worked, I'm like, I hate you.
Really? Yeah, because you're right. We've been taught as Final Fantasy players forever, don't bother with status stuff for bosses. And here's the one boss where you can. And seems a little cheap, but yeah.
Well, that's the thing you find out, though. Every boss in that game, there's some weird trick to fight it.
Yes. Which is really cool and really interesting and varied. Really, you're right. There are little gotchas that you can use little exploits you can use to get an advantage. Terrifying. It's a scary looking thing too. It's a skeleton sticking out of a wall.
Creepy looking wall.
It's not a great wall. Don't have that wall. Just don't make that wall. That wall is not necessary. Anyway, but yeah, it's interesting to play them though as an adult, and that's why I like hearing how people played them as kids, because the experience had to be different. Because me as an adult playing it, I'm connecting to that story of change and like the themes, and I can see as a kid being like my kick-ass Dark Knight is now a wimpy paladin, and he stinks, and he's
I hate
Cecil stinks now. Like, what?
Why does he have a cape?
And you can't equip any of those weapons. All your weapons are gone. So you have to like. And if you don't think to just buy extra weapons before he turns into a paladin, he's literally useless. Luckily, you're with two people who are pretty decent. You're with three, Palamporum and Tella, or Terra. Forget Tella. And so luckily they're good enough to get you through. But it ain't fun, man. Jeff, do you have any other memories of Final Fantasy IV before we move on to Final Fantasy VI? Because I love this whole thing of just it's just tiptoeing our way through the story of Final Fantasy IV.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you start out with this like world map and you're just blown away going around it, right? And you're like, oh no, now you're underground this thing, and there's this other kind of world down there, and then now we're going to the moon, and you can go on the moon, and you're like, well, where are we going next? I have no idea, but like I'm ready for it. Let's go fight the moon god or whatever we're doing. But I remember figuring out there was like I don't know if it was that one or 6. Again, now I'm getting crossed, but it was with the Ganji gloves. I think you could duplicate like an Excalibur weapon or something, and I remember when I figured that out, the game was just cake. It was just like I was just slicing through everything. Didn't even matter. So at the end of it, if we feel that the games are supposed to like slowly build your character, that paladin by the end of it, I was just like, yeah, nothing could touch me. Let's finish this game. Let's go.
That's awesome.
But it was one of those things where it would just suck me in, and I was I was in that game for a long, long time, and I couldn't pin the amount of hours on it because, like, again, childhood brain. I don't know if it was 80 hours or 8 hours, and I just sprinted through, but I'm pretty sure it was like 80, like, and above. And my parents are asking me, like, where are you for dinner? And I can't pause, and I have to leave it there, right? Or I can't save, but I can pause. But the whole thing's running all the time, and that was one of those games that would heat up the SNES. So that would be on all the time.
And Final Fantasy IV, again, 2 in North America, that was a launch title for the SNES. It was launch window.
Really?
It actually might have been proper launch, like first 4 games for the SNES, but it was definitely launch window. It was definitely for Christmas.
Wow,
that was early SNES. That's why when you play Final Fantasy VI, which of course is 3 in North America, that's why it's such a gigantic leap, because that was 4 years later. And
again, mind warp. I have no idea.
Yeah. Fantasy 4 before we move on to 6? Because I'm clamoring to talk about 6. Because again, like I said, it's gonna be a month.
Okay, so final thoughts on it. And I know there are 2 different types of Final Fantasy, well, 3 technically, if you count Final Fantasy 14 only fans, because they exist. There's the 2 types of fans. If we ignore Final Fantasy 14 only fans, there are those who jumped in who like the modern style, which is more action oriented, and those who prefer the classic style. And sometimes there's crossover where people can appreciate all of them, like you and I. We can appreciate each one because, there is no real set formula for what a Final Fantasy is, because each title evolves upon something. But if you are in the camp of you've started with a newer one, and as much as Square Enix keeps saying, start Final Fantasy with 7 Rebirth. No. Start it with Remake. No. Play some of the classics, because, and I'm not trying to be, an elitist or a gatekeeper, but it's always great. And I say this not only about Final Fantasy, but gaming as a whole. The same thing I say for music and for movies and just art, literature, and everything. It helps to understand where things came from or started to where they are now, because you can appreciate it a lot more. So
do that. Yeah, man. Absolutely. I totally agree with that. I think 4 is a great entry point for someone who wants to experience the old 16-bit style. Yeah. I would take, honestly, 4 over 6, even though I do like 6 more. 6 is a very important game to me. Like, that's a formative moment thing for me. But 4 is so streamlined, and it's not terribly hard.
Yeah.
it kind of just goes. It's relatively linear. It feels big, but it's relatively linear, and it's curated. Has this really cool curated vibe, and it just moves. It's 20 hours max, unless you take your lot of time. I always say when people ask the question, hey, what's the first Final Fantasy you should play? If you want like the very first one, I always say 10, because I think 10 is the most accessible, approachable of all of them, and it gives you the best flavor. I don't think it's the best, but I think it's the most approachable.
Yeah.
Before it'd be right in after that, if you want to appreciate like the older style. It's also ridiculously good. Even more gooder than I would say 4 is Final Fantasy 6. How's that for a segue? Not just yet. We have a few weeks before we get to Final Fantasy 6 and what's looking like over a month of content about that one game. But there's so much there, and there are so many comments and opinions. We're just going to have to go there, and we're just going to have to do it. But until then, thank you so much for listening to this edition of A Gamer Looks at 40. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend. That's the best way to spread the word about the podcast, especially if they're a Final Fantasy nut. This is where they ought to be listening for the next 4 months, probably at least. So be sure to do that. And a like and a rating on your pod player of choice is also appreciated as well. And go to agamerlooksit40.com for all of my everything, including links to my social media, full playlists of the series, including Legend of Zelda, Earthbound, and Tales from the Bargain Bin, among others. Many thanks to Pete and Kev from the Discord for editing the interviews. Many thanks to you for listening. And until next time, just be kind to yourselves and each other.